Thank you very much for your patience. I feel I am continuing in this sequence, maybe which we should call sacred cow tipping, because I want to talk about sensory substitution. And the title of my talk, sorry, I'll try and turn away a bit. The title of my talk is Attuning to the World, Sensory Substitution or Sensorimotor Recalibration. And I want to talk about a couple of different things here. Next slide. I want to think about revisiting the concept of sensory substitution. And in fact, what this might end up doing is pointing the way towards some of the things that people like Michael and Josh have suggested might be the way to providing functional elements of vision using other methods without actually thinking about restoring sight. So I think in this, there may be a possible pathway to that solution. So thinking about revisiting sensory substitution, talking about something called the externalization challenge, which is kind of at the heart of sensory substitution, looking at the role that movement plays in bringing forth the world, and then reframing sensory substitution with a final thought for designers of what might be these kind of systems in the future, not particularly sensory substitution, but things that might relay information to people who have little or no vision. Next slide. In the 1970s and 80s, Bach-y-Rita and colleagues carried out a series of studies here at Smith-Kettlewell, where they asked participants, where they gave participants live feeds from cameras, presented them to them as tactile stimuli on their back. They were trying to discover whether participants would be able to figure out what was going on in the world beyond the lens of the camera, given what they were feeling. Next slide. And the picture here shows the sensory substitution device. It's for some person sitting in a chair with the camera on an arm above their head. And I think the chair is kind of like a dentist chair. I think it's still in Smith-Kettlewell somewhere. And embedded in the back of that chair are 4 tactors in an array. And so the idea here is that as the camera views the scene in front of the participant, they will feel some impression on their back. Next slide. And what the researchers found was that the most important finding was that people, when they were able to control the camera themselves, i.e. when they took hold of the arm and moved the camera, they were much better at figuring out the position and form and presence of objects in the camera's view. Bach-y-Rita attributed this to something that he called neuroplasticity. He suggested that signals being sent to the brain from the back were somehow being processed by part of the visual cortex. Next slide. Many people have sort of, this should be slide 7, yeah. Many others have looked at this so-called externalization challenge. And one question it raises is to what extent people were able to associate this stimuli they were perceiving, whether they associated it with the image that they were feeling on their back, or whether they really did think that the source of information was coming from the outside world beyond the camera. Bach-y-Rita claimed that people could externalize this stimuli to the outside world. And as evidence, he reported on the fact that when he threw a ball at a blind person who was experienced in using the TVSS, they actually ducked. And since then, many other people have looked at this so-called externalization challenge, trying to determine whether people using these devices could associate proximal stimuli, that is, in this case, what they felt on their back, with the stimuli coming from distal objects, things out in the world. Next slide. And one group that looked at this quite recently, actually, were Auvray and his colleagues in France, using an audio visual substitution system. And they wanted to determine a couple of things. First of all, could people determine the existence of a correlation between the movements, their own movements, and the stimuli that they were receiving in response? Were they able to distinguish stimuli arising from direct versus indirect manipulation of an object? In the case of indirect, that means manipulating the object with a handle as opposed to directly manipulating it. And could they detect the presence of a background that was distinct from the foreground objects that were causing the stimulation? So another way of framing these questions that posed by Aubrey was, did participants extract laws of covariance between their movements and the stimuli that they were perceiving? Did they deduce the existence of a perceptual space originating from the outside world? And did they individualize the objects or individuate the objects that were causing the stimulation? Slide 11. No, it's 11. Oh, sorry, 10 here. You're right. They found that, they found that regardless of the kind of experimental condition they created, participants were able to perceive the link between their movements and what they felt. Less commonly did they notice or perceive the presence of this external scene in which objects might be situated. They were less convinced by the presence of the whole scene around the objects that were creating the stimulation. Next slide. Aubrey, in line with others in the field of embodied cognition, came to realize that participants were engaging in something that we do all the time when we try to acquire a new skill, namely trying to figure out how our movements relate to the changes in stimulation arriving at our sense organs, something which has been called developing new sensorimotor contingencies. Next slide. And the idea of sensorimotor contingencies comes from the work of Ray and Noah, and they define sensorimotor contingencies as the lawful relations between movement and the associated changes in sensory stimulation arising in response to that movement. And the important thing here is that in order for these sensorimotor contingencies to arise, there has to be active participation from the individual through their bodily movements. And on this image, which is a little bit complicated, it comes from Noah and O'Regan's paper. It shows the way in which a retinal image of a horizontal line is altered as the eyeball moves upwards. And the retinal image is a projection, so that as the eye moves upwards, a horizontal line in the center of the retina becomes a curve across the top of the retina. And that might seem counterintuitive until you realize, of course, that a retinal projection is pre-inversion. So when the image is projected on the retina, it's upside down, and then the brain turns it the right way up, which explains why the curve moves upwards, or the curve appears as the top of the retina. Next slide. Aubrey and others propose that so-called sensory substitution is not therefore a process of translating information intended for one sense modality into information that can be presented to a second modality. They argue that systems such as the TVSS work, if they do, because users have learned to discover invariant properties in the structure of the energy coming to them via the camera, in this case, light energy. Coincidental that it's light energy. This information is present distally in the structure of light falling on the lens of the camera. Over time, participants, quote, attune to the ways in which their movements cause the structure in this light energy to change. Next slide. Bodily, in this slide shows how bodily movement reveals the structure in light. And this is an image which was drawn for a book that I've just submitted. So it's by an artist called Hans Andersen, actually. And the caption says, global optical expansion accompanying forward movement is shown as a velocity vector field radiating outward from a point of expansion. So what the heck does that mean? The image here is of a road, and the road is traveling away from the viewer, and there are lines on the or arrows on the road showing the sort of vector of motion. And for those of you who are visually impaired and haven't experienced this idea of lines in a distance, what happens is that as the road goes away, the sides sort of converge into a point eventually. But if you're moving along that road, the point moves with you, and yet the objects that you come across either side of you sort of move past you in a flow, a sort of Gibsonian flow of optical information. And so as the objects come towards you, the field of view is sort of expanded to accommodate this. There's a nice auditory equivalent. If you've ever walked down a street where, say, an alarm is ringing on a shop or something in the distance, you can't really tell which side of the street it's on. But as you walk towards it, the auditory field expands and it becomes evident that it's on one particular side of the street. So next slide. The sensorimotor interpretation of sensory substitution is not the same as Bach-y-Rita's neuroplasticity interpretation. Neuroplasticity implies a rewiring of the neural pathways, whereas sensory substitution or sensorimotor contingencies are relationships between action and sensation. Attuning to these relationships requires the active participation of the user, the sensory substitution user's body. In the same way as babies move to discover how the world changes in response to their movements, people learning to use new devices engage with the information, the new information these devices pick up in order to figure out what this information reveals for them about the world. Next slide. Participants in Bach-y-Rita's study and those in the studies of Auvray and others use their own bodily movements to discover new sensorimotor contingencies. Users are learning to correlate their movements with new sources of information, whether these sources be sounds delivered over headphones or information delivered through tactors on their backs. Next slide. And the point or the takeaway for designers of any kind of technology that is going to deliver new forms of information that happen to be structure in light to blind people is that you can't really design sensory substitution systems. All you can do is to design the sort of circumstances mediated by technology under which participants can discover for themselves new sensory motor contingencies. And that is all I wanted to say. I need to show the next slide though. This is a conflict of interest. In another life, I'm a co-founder of a startup called New Haptics, where we're developing a full-page tactile array to sort of display information through braille and tactile graphics and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. We have time for a couple of questions. Let's see, Tyler first.
Can you say more about your teaser in the last slide? What's the resolution that you're aiming at, and how are the fingers going to be able to handle it? No.
Well, I just have to put that on any presentation, I'm told by my university. So the resolution is currently braille dot spacing. Eventually, we hope to initially produce a 5-line display of braille cells, but eventually expanding hopefully to a full page of equally spaced cells at braille spacing. Eventually, we might be able to do finer, but that's what we're aiming at the moment. And it will be very similar to a standard single line device, except with just more lines. It's driven by pneumatics, so that's how we can get away with having actuators that fit under pins, which is always a challenge for these devices.
One more question back there.
Hi, Ben Backus here. So there's a really good question about the representations that get built when you learn to do new motor actions using sensory stimuli that you have never used before. Do you have any thoughts about whether people who get used to using a sensory substitution device build any kind of a new qualia or new perceptual experience, or whether they the qualia that they experience is entirely based on qualia they were able to build before.
I think the point is that sensory substitution in its sort of original formulation probably doesn't work. And the reason I'm saying that is because even in the work of Auvray, where they said people were very good at figuring out the correlation between their movements and how the energy array that happened to be conveyed by the camera changed in response to those movements. Where they were less successful was in determining the presence of background and foreground information, which visually is usually just, identified by shadows and things like perspective and stuff like those, that those cues really belong to the domain of light and, the way the visual system picks up light. I think the really interesting thing, and probably the thing that Michael would also agree with, is what's the body in the world is information that guides action. And I think the interesting thing is that the information in light or sound or even in tactile information you pick up through your cane that guides action, however you get that, that is what you're tuning into, because it has efficacy for helping you get around the world. It's not clear whether pictorial information being presented to people who've never been able to see would ever have any value in a sort of a lived experience where the most important thing is to get around in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes. And what I was thinking more was a description of a belt that I read about that would always stimulate true north. And the people who wore this belt, the claim was that they developed kind of a new percept that they really liked of true north. So it's rooted in the energy they get from the new stimulation, not recreating a percept in some other modality. But they felt northiness.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's true. If you could somehow use, we'll say, some kind of belt or whatever to sort of really integrate information about distal objects that are beyond the end of the cane in a meaningful way that would allow somebody to sort of have forewarning of lampposts would be great. That they can plan. Now, somebody once gave a really nice description of guide dogs and canes. They said guide dogs are really obstacle avoidance devices. Canes are obstacle detection devices. And there's a lot of effort required to find an obstacle or to come upon an obstacle, detect it, and then figure out how to get around it. So anything that can sort of help you do that forward planning that doesn't require you to get into that mess in the first place, I think that's something about information out in the world that could be conveyed via a camera, just because cameras are good at picking up distal information, not because cameras work like eyes. There might be a useful way to represent that could sort of, usefully sort of help people navigate. But that's not the same as sort of reading to them the names of every store that they go past, which is kind of very distracting if your auditory sense is something that you use to echolocate with, then overlaying this extra information is actually kind of saturating a channel that's already very valuable.
Thank you.
Sheila, I'm going to give you one more question from the Zoom chat here, from a fan of embodied cognition. Implicit in this talk is an underlying theoretical conversation about representationalism. The evidence presented is of a more dynamicist flavor. A more dynamicist flavor, excuse me. I am curious about the theoretical context of the speaker's work.
Right, so it's a sort of another part of my work. So I became interested in embodied cognition when I was a grad student at Stanford. I worked at the Center for Computer Research and Music and Acoustics, otherwise known as CARMA, and was taught by Roger Shepard. And although Roger Shepard had some of his earliest work kind of belonged to the representationalist tradition, I think towards the end of his life, he began to realize that dynamic information in vision was probably functionally more relevant for an organism in the environment than the things we think of as pictures, which kind of came to dominate psychology in the 20th century just because the first thing we could make. making sort of really convincing sound information through stereo imagery and stuff only became possible in the sort of 40s and 50s, and we're still trying to do touch. So pictures and moving pictures and things like that came around first, and the kind of, in a way, boosted representationalism. Probably, of course, pictorial information is important, but maybe dynamic information available visually or through any other modality got sort of sidelined because of that sort of historical happening. I'm not sure if that answers the question. So my own background, sorry, kind of developed from that work and being then interested in the work of Gibson. I think haptics too, that was my main field. Haptics kind of guides you towards more dynamic thinking, because you can't, if you stop moving your hand, things fade from your tactile view. So you have to move to pick up information. And so embedded in any study of haptics is this notion of sort of movement-based acquisition of information.
Thank you, Sheila. Let's thank Sheila one more time.